The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
Good evening. I'm Chris Bury. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of In the Loop. Here in Chicago, one of the nation's great melting pot cities, the battle over immigration is raging again. Chicago is a sanctuary city, meaning undocumented people can access city services, including police protection, without fear of being turned over to immigration authorities. Now the election of Donald Trump, who has threatened to deport millions of undocumented residents, has led to new concerns in a city brimming with generations of immigrants. Chicago, a town built by immigrants, has a long history of welcoming people from all over the world. More than 1.7 million people born in other countries live in Illinois, a large percent of them here in the Chicago area. Nearly half were born in Latin American countries. Cecilia Garcia, a U.S. citizen, and Hugo Velasco, her Mexican-born husband, met in Chicago more than 20 years ago. Hugo crossed into the country illegally. He was the breadwinner for Cecilia and their 5 children until he was picked up and deported back to Mexico.
He was deported in 2012, driving without a license. So it's been 4 years since our separation. I do go see him at least once a year.
Before his 2012 deportation, Hugo had been deported once before. Cecilia now fears her husband will not be able to return to the United States legally. And with the election of Donald Trump, she is deeply concerned for all immigrants.
Some people don't even want to go to work anymore. And then they're instilling this fear in their children. And then the children, they see the parents getting fearful. Then there's the stress and they get sick. And that's what worries me, our children.
For many undocumented immigrants, that future seems even more uncertain if President-elect Trump has his way. He centered his campaign on building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico and deporting millions of illegal immigrants.
I will build a great, great wall on our southern border, and I will have Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words.
Ever since former Mayor Harold Washington held office, Chicago has made it official policy to protect immigrants. In 1985, Washington signed an executive order prohibiting city employees from enforcing immigration laws. Cook County Commissioner Jesus Chuy Garcia says Washington took the action after a series of federal raids that rounded up undocumented workers.
He said, "We will not tolerate the federal government, the Immigration Service, from engaging in these types of actions because they are unconstitutional, they are discriminatory and racist, and they come as a result of racial profiling."
Now Mayor Rahm Emanuel is trying to reassure the immigrant community that Chicago's commitment to them has not changed with the election of Donald Trump.
It always will be a sanctuary city. To all those who are, after Tuesday's election, very nervous, there's filled with anxiety has been spoken to, you are safe in Chicago. You are secure in Chicago, and you are supported in Chicago.
Mayor Emanuel cemented his commitment by creating a $1.3 million legal protection fund to help immigrants threatened with deportation. That's welcome news for the more than 500,000 undocumented immigrants who call Chicago home. 5 years ago, Commissioner Garcia strengthened the city's sanctuary status with a new ordinance that prevented local authorities from turning over undocumented immigrants because of minor violations.
Whereby people who might wind up in Cook County Jail for the smallest of infractions of the law, like driving and not having a turn signal that worked, could land you in Cook County Jail if you were arrested. We also said that we would no longer respond to requests from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency of the federal government that if they wanted to hold someone, if we would abide by that only when they came to us with a warrant from a court that said that individual X needed to be transferred to the custody of the federal government.
Melissa Sanchez is a journalist for the Chicago Reporter. She says ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has a reputation for picking up and detaining undocumented immigrants.
Just a couple of months ago in the Albany Park area, 3 guys, ICE randomly stopped, picked them up, and then hauled them off into deportation proceedings. And that was not something that had been seen in a really long time in the city. And they do show up at people's homes and end up putting them in the deportation proceedings. They tend to go after people who have some sort of criminal record. That is a priority of the federal government.
But Chicago's status as a sanctuary city has its share of critics. Steve Cortez, the head of Donald Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council, says the city should not protect undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes.
It's not a sanctuary for people who have to live with dangerous people who don't belong in their community. It's not a sanctuary for police who have to deal, many of whom are people of color, by the way, who have to deal with these dangerous criminals whom they know in many cases are here illegally, and yet they're not pursuing deportation because they're ordered not to by the city administration, by their mayor.
For Chicago and other localities considered sanctuary cities, that designation could cost them big money if President-elect Trump follows through on his threat.
We will cancel all federal funding to sanctuary cities.
Commissioner Garcia says more than $2 billion in city and county funds could be at risk.
Funding for housing, for emergency services, for transportation, a variety of things that are an important part of our budget, our respective budgets in city and county governments.
From what I understand, it would likely apply more than anything to Department of Justice grants, so they go toward policing, local policing work.
I hope they use the purse strings as probably the most effective way, particularly for a city like Chicago, which is in terrible financial situation anyway, cannot afford to lose any funds.
But for Cecilia Garcia, her fight with the incoming administration is simple. She's calling on defenders of immigrants to stand up to protect Chicago's historic role as a sanctuary city.
Action speaks louder than words, and if we allow that, if we don't speak up, then yes, then he can do what he wants. But if we speak up and we defend ourselves, there's no way. There's no way.
Last week, Chicago City Council approved that $1.3 million fund to assist immigrants with legal services. And joining us now to discuss Chicago's role as a sanctuary city are Von Wen, Law Fellow for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, Christina Garcia, Mobilization Manager for Alianza Americas, and Kathleen Arnold, Political Science Professor at DePaul University. And welcome to everybody. Von, let me start with you. Why was it important for Mayor Emanuel to make that statement reaffirming Chicago's role as a sanctuary city?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was comforting for people to hear from the leader of our city, right, that Chicago will remain a sanctuary city. What we're seeing in other cities is when mayors are not speaking up, or, you know, you see a lot of colleges and schools where they're saying, we're going to deny sanctuary status to these places, to these students. And I think that's very scary for people. So I think it's a good first step forward for this city. But, you know, I think it's also important to reiterate that after the election, we can't go about things as business as usual, right? I think there's a lot more that the city could be doing to protect its undocumented community. And so I think there's much more that the city could also be doing rather than just a resolution alone.
Well, Christina, do you think that resolution, even if it was just a matter of words, do you think it resonated with the immigrant community here in Chicago?
Absolutely. I think that it's critical that during this point in time, right, that mayors, right, and that our leadership overall really reaffirms their commitment to the residents and the working people of our city. And I think that by doing that, you sort of give them the confidence, right, to fight collectively, right? And so I think it's also a responsibility that our government and our government officials have, especially in cities like Chicago that want to continue to be world-class cities, in the words of our mayor, to continue to be that, right? And I think that we can't leave out, all of these people who basically make the working people of the backbone of a city like Chicago. So it's absolutely critical that happens.
Kathleen, we hear a lot about sanctuary city, and I think there's some confusion surrounding the term itself. Is this a substantive thing, or is it mere symbolism?
I think it's somewhere in between. It's an act of leadership, as you just stated, and it is comforting to immigrants in the city. There are concerns that the police need to be more uniformly trained, for example, in order for it to be a true sanctuary city, but it certainly is a great first step. It's an act of leadership that Emmanuel kind of enacted right after Trump was elected. But more could be done, including more oversight over the police, more training of the police to let them know what a sanctuary city is and is not. Those are some of the concerns on the ground right now.
The idea is that unless you are guilty of major crimes, that the police won't turn you in for something minor, like a traffic stop.
Right. The Morton memo of 2011 gave some guidance about that, and there are concerns that, for example, ICE is still violating that by picking people up when they're not supposed to. They're supposed to go after truly dangerous people and not people who have kind of civil violations, for example. And then the other part is just, again, having more uniformity amongst police when to stop people.
We're not the only city, Vaughn. We know Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, New York, Washington, D.C. Is this an idea that you think might spread at this time in American history?
Yeah, I mean, we're surely hoping so. And I think that's even more important for Chicago to sort of be the model city for other, counties and cities that are wanting to adopt a welcoming city policy. The city of Evanston just actually passed their welcoming city ordinance that was very sort of influenced by the Chicago model. And so I think, to what Kathleen is also saying, people aren't aware that within our welcoming city ordinance, though, there are categories of exception for people from protection, which is also very concerning.
What are those exceptions?
Some of those exceptions are if you're an individual in a gang database. However, you don't know how you're getting in a gang database. No one's really sure. It's sort of like the TSA no-fly list, right? How are you on there? How do you get off? What are the mechanisms for it? And people aren't very clear about that. It's not even individuals who have been convicted of something. It's individuals who are a current defendant in a case. And so if we're saying that we're going to protect all immigrants in the same way, then we really have to mean it. And I think to say that they need to be treated as the same as all residents in the city of Chicago.
Christine, is this smart politics for the mayor of Chicago?
I mean, I would think so. We are a city that depends on the labor force in order to keep our economy thriving at the local level. That also obviously feeds into the national, right? Similar to cities like San Francisco, like Boston, like LA, the list goes on. And I think that we've after Trump's declarations, I think what we've seen in terms of sanctuary cities is that not only have mayors doubled down, right, on their affirmations that they will remain sanctuary cities, but other cities have also chimed in. Also, other cities have also stepped up and said, we want to be also sanctuary cities. So I think it's not only smart politics, but it's a responsibility that our cities have towards the people of these cities who have helped build them, right? Yeah. And I think politically, it could even help solidify or bring together local jurisdictions like cities of Chicago, right, and others. So I think that perhaps the attempts by Trump could actually
backfire as well?
Backfire, yes.
Well, it's interesting
right.
during the campaign because Trump's point was that sanctuary cities make America less safe. And his intimation was that we are harboring criminals. And as we saw in the setup piece, there is some feeling among opponents here of the sanctuary city idea that it somehow is fostering crime.
Right, so people kind of portray it as if it were, it's kind of like the pot argument, that if you try pot, that you will then turn to harder drugs. The problem is this is actually a civil violation. It's not a criminal violation. And people use the word illegally, including our president, unfortunately, who I respect a lot, in the incorrect context. It is not a criminal offense to be undocumented, right? The students that Trump is targeting or will target in his first week of his presidency have been designated as people who have some sort of legal authorization to be here. So they will be made illegal through his suspension of their status, which I think is different than someone who robs you, for example, right?
Yeah. And I would say that the sanctuary city policies actually make our city safer. Because if you have at any given point a group of people that are unwilling to come forward with crimes being committed in their own neighborhoods, that just creates a sense of fear for the entire community, right? Immigrants, whether they're undocumented or not, do not live in silos. They live as part of members of extended communities, right? So to the degree that we can continue to keep our communities safe by encouraging these individuals to come forward, right, and report crimes, right, and sort of serve as safe, sort of people who also help secure their own neighborhoods, then we're all together more safe.
We heard from Chuy Garcia that he introduced this ordinance which would prevent the Chicago police or Cook County from turning over minor criminals to the federal authorities. But then where do we draw the line? I mean, do we draw the line at traffic misdemeanors? Do we draw the line at felonies or violent felonies? I mean, at what point should undocumented people be turned over to federal authorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we get to that, there's a lot of technicalities with immigration law that people aren't aware of. You know, I think to what Kathleen was saying, people are getting picked up for minor violations, you know, sort of these simple possession charges, and those are the cases in which they're being deported. And I think what we're trying to push for is to say that there are due process procedures in place to protect immigrants, and those are the procedures that we should be following. I think we heard from Commissioner Garcia that, you know, there should be a judicial warrant out, right? When an individual needs to be picked up, there needs to be a process in which ICE has to go through, and we haven't really seen that. There's a lack of transparency. There's these administrative warrants that are issued by ICE, but
in other words, ICE should get the warrant and present it to Cook County or Chicago instead of just picking people up off the street. Is that
Although the police have to follow the Constitution, they have to uphold criminal protections, and that's why actually a criminal system is better. It doesn't sound like it would be better, but it's actually better than a civil system. ICE is not held to the same standards, and that's why they can operate outside of the law. They don't have the same transparency. They're not bound to that transparency. And that's why it's actually even more important, even if you are on the conservative side of things, to want that separation. The police should be able to do their jobs without having to kind of double dip in the extra constitutional area.
I mean, there's a major Third Circuit court case where, you know, this county was following an ICE detainer that was issued, but then later on the court found that there was actually no probable cause for that detainer, and so the county actually got sued for something like that, you know, and for them, they were pointing at ICE, ICE was pointing at them, and so that's, you know, a major individual violation, and yet there was no way to sort of redress something like that.
So it's a conflict of interest, basically, and it doesn't allow the police to actually do their job. Back to the point that you had made earlier, most statistics show that undocumented immigrants are more often the victim of violent crime rather than the perpetrators.
President-elect Trump is now threatening, or he has threatened during the campaign, to cut off, in his words, all federal funds for sanctuary cities. There's some debate. I mean, Chicago gets about $2 billion if you throw in Cook County. Some people think it's just these Justice Department grants, which are about $30 million. When you listen to that threat, do you think it's genuine or bluster? Christina, you want to take a stab?
I think it's there's a lot of scare tactics on which Donald Trump campaigned on, and that's one of them. I know he promises to move forward with that within the first 100 days. I think that cities that are doubling down are just creating coalitions within their own sort of local jurisdictions to make sure that if that indeed was to happen, we're sort of seeking out, right, and we're becoming stronger and really building internally. So as we were going back to some of the things we were saying earlier, this could serve as a backfire.
But at the same time, Chicago doesn't exactly have a big budget surplus. It's short on money, and losing even $30 million, Kathleen, isn't that significant?
Yeah, but there are two answers to that. First of all, the federal funds were already cut. We've already been a sanctuary city, and so he's threatening something that already occurred, and Chicago survived. And as someone with a school-aged child, I don't think our budgetary crisis is necessarily natural. It could have to do with certain politicians holding up the budget.
Right. I don't want to go down that road. But just in,
I'm just saying it's a bit
but just in terms
artificial.
of Trump saying, look,
Sorry.
I'm going to cut Chicago off, and what does that mean?
I think it's interesting that the president-elect's party is proposing something like that. I'm reminded of when the ACA was passed and how they were accusing Democrats of doing the same thing, right, of withholding federal funding and mandating.
Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the Affordable Care Act, and mandating states to implement, some sort of marketplace. And the reverse is sort of true now, right, where you're threatening federal funding for something that I think it isn't within the purview of local jurisdiction.
You guys know, like the federal funding was already cut.
Yeah.
So he would have to go outside of the existing memorandum of understanding and so on that has been forged under the Obama administration. So I think he'd have to do a lot more than he thinks.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're probably headed down a legal battle. I don't know that cities would immediately just sort of throw the towel in and say, okay, I give up and go ahead and take my funding. I think that if there's enough of an echo nationwide, right, with all of these cities sort of really stepping forward and sort of reaffirming this, I think we're in for a legal battle if we have to. We have places like California who just appointed Javier Becerra as their attorney general.
Right. So this could be, this could be in the courts for a long time. As we know, Mayor Emanuel went to New York City to see Donald Trump. One of the things they talked about was the young people who came here as immigrants. President Obama has signed an executive order protecting them. The executive order is known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. But now many are worried that these young people are at risk, and we should hear from Reverend Walter Coleman. He's pastor of the Alberto United Methodist Church, a church which has protected immigrants from deportation in the past.
The threat to kids is that their parents are going to be taken away from them. There were, I think in Illinois, last count, there were about 8 suicides of dreamers who felt like their lives were just going to be taken away from them. But they had, we had won the executive order from Barack, which allowed them to stay and have work permits and so forth. It's about 800,000 of them. They became very depressed. So it was, it was a shock. It was a shock, and there was a lot of fear. And then gradually we have to pray and counsel and get perspective and realize that there's a lot of support for these families and for these young people. And we're seeing different things happen, that are supportive, and that if we can maintain a popular front here, and mobilize, that we can protect them.
So Reverend Coleman is talking about fear among immigrants and children. Is that justified? Van?
Yeah, I definitely think so. But I think to also look at the issue with DACA recipients, not in a bubble of itself, right? Students are surrounded by families. There's a lot of mixed statuses families in Chicago, and so it's important to sort of have an approach where you're protecting the DACA recipients, but you're also protecting, all immigrants as a whole, which is something that I know it's not a part of the mainstream narrative, but I'm hoping that we can get there.
In terms of the immigration proposals that Donald Trump is proposing, I mean, he did win the election. He's going to be the president-elect of the United States. You're looking at his appointments, and it's obvious that millions of Americans support his views. So what if he becomes more aggressive, Kathleen? What if, in fact, he makes good on the promise to start more deportations, soon after he takes office?
I think he's going to suspend people's visas, and I think he's going to suspend DACA. But I don't think he's actually going to follow through on the deportation. So I think there's time, but I'm just calculating. And the deportation part of it will be difficult because ICE is going to have to go through people's apartment buildings and go into schools. It's going to create an atmosphere of fear. It's also going to create, I think, a number of economic issues, as you've been indicating. And so I think that's when the millions of people who voted for him will start to realize what they voted for. It's one thing to suspend people's visas. It's another thing to create a police state and start profiling.
Well, we talked about the crime issue before and Trump's view that immigrants cause a lot of crime. The other part of his appeal was the economic argument that immigrants are taking jobs from Americans.
I think that's sort of this myth that has been sort of perpetuated. If we look at the actual statistics, there's about 10,000 people, baby boomers, who are retiring on a daily basis, and this trend is continuing on until the year 2030, which brings us to about 87 million people that will sort of leave the workforce. So what does that tell us? That immigrants are actually a contributing force to the nation as a whole. When immigrants come here from other countries, usually they're young. We're talking in their teens or in their 20s. And so this is a whole sort of new, energized workforce that is coming here to do, let's face it, a lot of work that our nation relies on, a big service industry, right? Areas like service, hospitality, construction. Right now, we are having a battle about even doing things like raising the minimum wage. So I don't know that immigrants are to be blamed for taking American jobs. I think that's...
What about that, Vaughn? I mean, on those 2 points, I mean, Trump's supporters are saying, number one, immigrants are dangerous, and number two, they're taking our jobs.
It's just not true. I think to what Christina is saying, you see residents moving out of Chicago, and the number of immigrants moving into the city is what has actually increased. And so immigrants are actually upholding, the city. And immigrants, we create jobs, right? We're contributing to the economy. There's also these false notions that like immigrants take up resources and they don't pay taxes, which just isn't true. And so I think to sort of push back against that's never been the case. And to what you're saying, just continue to perpetuate that myth, which we don't see that,
In fact, we have a need for immigrants to come and work and make our nation great, help build. And I think most studies reflect that.
Since the election and even before, we've seen some episodes of hate directed at immigrants and Muslims and people of other faiths. I'd like to hear your concerns about that wider picture of how the climate in this country may be changing. Kathleen?
I think there were already a number of groups that were anti-immigration since at least 9/11. And so I don't think Trump necessarily led people to these acts of hate. These acts of hate, unfortunately, have been occurring.
Why have they been increasing, do you think, Christina?
I think I don't know that necessarily they've been increasing, but I think that more people...
Or getting more attention.
They're getting more attention, and I think more people, I think the Trump era sort of enabled people's sort of innermost feelings, which I like to say that all of the people that supported for Trump, that does not mean that, all of these people are bigots and racists. What that points to is that we have a real fear of people living in a state of, not being able to purchase or to sort of live their livelihoods, right? Their middle class is shrinking.
We have to stop it at that point because we are out of time. So I'd like to thank all of our guests tonight, Vaughn Wen, Christina Garcia, and Kathleen Arnold. To learn more about our show, visit wycc.org and look for the link to In the Loop. Until next week, I'm Chris Bury. Good night.